How successful people think differently. The mental habits that separate those who achieve from those who don't. Written and narrated by MSE Boost. Successful people do not think harder than everyone else. They think differently. That distinction matters more than any advice you have ever received about goal setting, motivation, or productivity. And misunderstanding it is precisely why most self-improvement efforts produce temporary enthusiasm followed by permanent disappointment. Here is what makes this uncomfortable. The mental patterns responsible for achievement are not mysterious, rare, or reserved for people born with unusual gifts. They are identifiable, learnable, and transferable, but they require something most people resist giving up: the familiar thought habits that feel like just who I am. The gap between wanting success and actually getting it is not found in your schedule, your resources, or your circumstances. It exists in the space between what happens to you and how your mind automatically interprets what happened. That interpretation happens so fast, so seamlessly, that most people never notice they are running a program that was installed decades ago by people who may not have achieved much themselves. Chapter 1. The mental gap between wanting and getting. The distinction between achievers and everyone else becomes visible only when you slow down the mental process enough to see what is actually happening inside your head. Most books skip this part. They jump straight to tactics. Wake up earlier, set better goals, find your why, without ever addressing the operating system those tactics have to run on. Trying to install achievement behaviors on top of a mental framework designed for comfort and safety is like downloading professional software onto a computer still running a 20-year-old operating system. It does not matter how good the software is, the hardware cannot support it. Something happens the moment your alarm goes off in the morning. Before your feet touch the floor, before you consciously decide anything, your mind has already started running calculations. These calculations determine how much resistance you will feel toward your goals that day, how you will interpret the emails waiting in your inbox, how you will respond when something goes wrong around 2 p.m., and whether you will follow through on the commitment you made to yourself the night before. None of this is random. None of it is personality. All of it is pattern, mental pattern that runs automatically beneath your awareness, shaping your day before you have taken a single intentional action. The reason most people stay stuck is not a lack of information. Bookstores are full of information. The internet has more information than any human could process in 1,000 lifetimes. Stuck people do not lack knowledge about what to do. They lack the mental framework that turns knowledge into consistent action. They know they should wake up earlier, exercise more, work on their most important projects first, and stop scrolling their phones at 11 p.m. Knowing has never been the problem. The problem lives in the automatic thoughts that arise the moment execution becomes necessary. Those automatic thoughts have a name. They are called mental defaults, and they operate like the factory settings on a new phone. Unless you deliberately change them, they run the show. Your mental defaults determine how you interpret setbacks, how you evaluate opportunities, how much risk feels tolerable, how quickly you bounce back from rejection, and whether you see obstacles as signals to stop or problems to solve. These defaults were not chosen by you. They were installed during childhood, adolescence, and early adulthood by parents, teachers, peers, and cultural messaging, most of whom were not high achievers themselves. This is not about blame. Your parents did their best with what they knew. Your teachers followed a curriculum designed for compliance, not excellence. Your peers were just as confused as you were. The point is not to assign fault, but to recognize a simple truth. The mental programming running your daily decisions was not designed with your success in mind. It was designed for social acceptance, emotional safety, and avoiding the kind of failure that makes you look foolish in front of others. These are reasonable goals for a child learning to function in society. They are terrible goals for an adult trying to build something meaningful. Mental defaults show up in 3 primary categories, and all 3 must be understood before any real change becomes possible. The first category is interpretation defaults. These govern how you make sense of events. Two people can experience the identical situation, a business setback, a rejected proposal, a failed attempt, and walk away with completely different conclusions. The person with achievement-oriented interpretation defaults processes that setback as information. This approach did not work. What adjustment would produce a different result? The person with protective interpretation defaults processes the same setback as identity confirmation. I knew this would happen. I am not the kind of person who succeeds at things like this. Same event, wildly different mental outcomes. And those different outcomes produce dramatically different next actions. The second category is expectation defaults. These determine what you believe is likely to happen before you try anything. Achievement-oriented expectation defaults are characterized by what researchers call realistic optimism, the genuine belief that effort produces results, combined with the understanding that results require sustained effort over time. Protective expectation defaults, by contrast, operate on a strange kind of hedged pessimism. They generate thoughts like, I will try, but it probably will not work, or I will give this a shot, but I am not getting my hopes up. This hedging feels emotionally safe. It protects against disappointment by building failure into the expectation. But it also creates a self-fulfilling prophecy. Half-hearted effort produces predictable results, and those results confirm the original low expectation. The third category is response defaults. These dictate what you do in the crucial moments after something goes wrong or right. Achievement-oriented response defaults drive immediate analysis, adjustment, and renewed action. Protective response defaults drive rumination, self-criticism, and withdrawal. When something goes badly, the protective mind starts running loops. Why does this always happen to me? What is wrong with me? Maybe I should not have tried in the first place. These loops feel like thinking, but they produce nothing useful. They burn mental energy without generating any actionable insight. Meanwhile, the achievement-oriented mind asks different questions. What specifically went wrong? What would I do differently next time? What can I do right now to move forward? Every mental default serves a purpose. The protective patterns that keep you stuck are not random bugs in your psychological software. They are features designed to protect you from social rejection, public failure, emotional pain, and the discomfort of uncertainty. The problem is not that these defaults exist. The problem is that they were installed during a time when protection was the primary goal, and they have never been updated for a life where growth matters more than safety. Most self-improvement advice fails because it tries to install new behaviors without addressing underlying defaults. You can set all the morning routines you want, but if your interpretation default says, I am not a morning person, your mind will find creative ways to sabotage that routine. You can write goals in your notebook every night, but if your expectation default says, I never follow through on things like this, you are setting up a battle between conscious intention and unconscious programming. And unconscious programming wins that fight almost every time. Think about what happens when you set a goal you genuinely care about. For the first few days, motivation carries you. You wake up earlier, you do the work, you feel good about yourself. But then, something shifts. The alarm goes off, and you feel tired. The project gets difficult. Someone criticizes your work. At that exact moment, your mental defaults activate. If those defaults are protective, they offer seductive rationalizations. You need rest to perform well. Maybe this is not the right time. One day off will not matter. That person is probably right. This idea was not that good anyway. These thoughts do not feel like self-sabotage. They feel like wisdom, like self-care, like maturity. That is what makes them so dangerous. They are dressed up in reasonable language, while quietly steering you away from the actions that would actually produce results. A common misconception about successful people is that they do not experience the same doubts, fears, and resistance as everyone else. This is completely false. High achievers feel all the same internal friction. The difference is what they do with that friction. When a protective default says, maybe you should not send that email, what if they say no? The achievement-oriented mind acknowledges the thought and then asks a different question. What is the actual cost of hearing no? When a protective default says, this project is taking longer than expected, maybe it is time to cut your losses, the achievement-oriented mind examines the thought and then asks, is the timeline the problem, or did I underestimate what this would require from the beginning? The mental gap between wanting and getting is measured in these micro moments. It is not measured in grand decisions or major life choices. Most people make reasonable, grand decisions. Most people choose sensible goals. The breakdown happens in the hundreds of small moments each week when defaults run the show, because no conscious override has been installed. Here is a practical way to start seeing your own defaults in action. For the next several days, pay attention to the thoughts that arise when you encounter any form of resistance. The moment something feels hard, uncomfortable, or risky, notice what your mind does. Does it start generating reasons to stop, slow down, or avoid? Does it start questioning whether the effort is worth it? Does it start comparing you unfavorably to others? Does it start predicting failure to soften the potential blow? None of these thoughts are wrong or bad. They are simply data. They show you what defaults are currently installed. The goal of this observation is not judgment. You do not need to criticize yourself for having protective defaults. Everyone has them. They are the psychological equivalent of factory settings. They came pre-installed, and you did not get to choose them. The goal is simply to see them clearly, to recognize them as patterns rather than as truth, and to understand that patterns can be changed once they are made visible. What separates this book from motivational material is a fundamental difference in approach. Motivational content tries to generate enough emotional intensity to override your defaults temporarily. It works for a while, sometimes a few hours, sometimes a few weeks, but defaults always reassert themselves because they were never actually changed. The approach here is different. Rather than trying to overpower your defaults with enthusiasm, the goal is to systematically replace them with patterns that actually support achievement. This replacement happens through a specific process. First, you have to see the default clearly. Most people never do this because their defaults feel like reality rather than interpretation. When your interpretation default says, I am not good at this kind of thing, that feels like a fact about the world, not a mental pattern you could change. Seeing the pattern as a pattern rather than as truth is the essential first step. Second, you have to understand what the default is trying to protect you from. Protective patterns are not irrational. They are trying to prevent specific emotional experiences: embarrassment, rejection, failure, disappointment. When you understand what a default is protecting against, you can address that underlying concern directly rather than fighting the surface-level thought. Third, you have to install a replacement pattern that serves your actual goals. This is not about positive thinking or affirmations. It is about building new automatic responses that generate different actions. When the old default says, this is going to fail, the new pattern does not respond with, no, it will definitely succeed. The new pattern responds with, what would I need to do to maximize my chances here? The new response is realistic, actionable, and oriented toward the future rather than toward emotional protection. Fourth, you have to practice the new pattern until it becomes automatic. This is where most people give up. They install a new response consciously, use it a few times, and then expect it to run on its own. That is not how mental patterns work. Defaults become defaults through repetition, hundreds or thousands of repetitions over years. Installing a new default requires significant repetition as well, though the process can be accelerated through deliberate practice. The framework for measuring where you currently stand involves honest assessment across all three default categories. For interpretation defaults, ask yourself, how do I typically explain things that go wrong? Do I look for external factors and actionable adjustments? Or do I conclude something about my own capabilities? There is no right answer here, only an accurate answer that shows you what pattern is currently running. For expectation, defaults, examine what you believe is likely to happen before you begin any significant effort. Do you expect that sustained work will produce results, or do you hedge your expectations to protect against disappointment? Pay attention to the language you use when describing goals to others. Phrases like, "I will try," or "we will see what happens," often signal protective expectation defaults. For response defaults, consider what you typically do in the hours and days after a setback. Do you analyze what happened and adjust your approach, or do you cycle through negative interpretations and self-criticism? Response defaults often feel the most automatic because they activate during emotional moments when conscious control is hardest to maintain. This assessment is not a test you can pass or fail. It is a diagnostic tool that shows you where change is needed. Most people discover that their defaults are protective in some areas and achievement-oriented in others. The person who responds well to professional setbacks might fall apart after personal rejection. The person who maintains optimistic expectations about their career might hold hedged expectations about their health or relationships. Patterns are domain-specific, which means you might need to address different defaults in different areas of your life. The chapters ahead build on this foundation. Decision-making patterns, how you evaluate choices and commit to action, will be examined in detail. The specific mental moves that high achievers make after failure will be broken down and made learnable. And the process of installing new defaults permanently, rather than temporarily, will be explained step by step. But none of that matters if the foundation here is not solid. The foundation is this: what you achieve in life is determined by your mental defaults more than by any other factor, not by your talent, your circumstances, your connections, or your resources, by your defaults. Those defaults were installed without your consent, but they are now your responsibility. They can be changed. They must be changed if different results are what you are after. The gap between wanting and getting is not a mystery. It is a measurable distance between how your mind currently operates and how it would need to operate to produce consistent achievement. Closing that gap is not about willpower. It is not about motivation. It is about rewiring the automatic patterns that run beneath your conscious awareness, replacing programs designed for protection with programs designed for growth. That work starts with seeing clearly. And now, having read this far, you are beginning to see. Chapter 2. How high achievers make decisions. Every decision you avoid makes the next decision harder to make. This compounding effect operates silently in the background of your life, building momentum in the wrong direction while you wait for clarity that never arrives. The people who consistently achieve what they set out to accomplish have not discovered a way to eliminate uncertainty from their decisions. They have developed a completely different relationship with uncertainty itself, and that relationship changes everything about how they move through the world. The difference between decisive people and everyone else is not confidence. Confident people hesitate all the time. The difference is not intelligence either. Brilliant people can spend years stuck in analysis paralysis, examining every angle of a decision until the opportunity disappears entirely. What separates high achievers is something far more practical. They use a filtering system that most people have never been taught. This system does not make decisions easier. It makes them faster without making them reckless. And speed, when it comes to decisions, turns out to matter far more than most people realize. Here is why speed matters. Decisions are not isolated events. Every choice you make either builds your capacity to decide or erodes it. When you delay a decision out of fear or discomfort, you teach your brain that this type of decision is dangerous, something to be avoided. The next similar decision becomes harder, not easier. When you make a decision quickly and deal with whatever comes next, you teach your brain that decisions are survivable, that outcomes can be managed, that you are capable of handling what follows. The next similar decision becomes lighter. This training effect is happening whether you are aware of it or not. The question is whether you are training yourself to be decisive or training yourself to be paralyzed. Most decision-making advice focuses on gathering more information, weighing pros and cons, and carefully analyzing options. This advice sounds reasonable and feels responsible. It is also why most people remain stuck. The problem is not a lack of information. The problem is a fundamental misunderstanding of what decisions are actually for. Decisions are not about finding the perfect option. They are about committing resources, time, energy, attention, money, to a direction so that you can learn what only action teaches. No amount of thinking can substitute for the information that comes from doing. The person who spends 3 months deciding whether to start a business learns almost nothing during those 3 months. The person who starts the business in week 1 and fails by week 8 has learned more than they could have discovered in years of contemplation. This does not mean you should make decisions randomly or without any consideration. It means the purpose of decision-making is not to find certainty before acting. The purpose is to reach a commitment threshold as quickly as possible so that real learning can begin. High achievers understand this intuitively. They are not less thoughtful than everyone else. They are thoughtful about different things. Instead of endlessly analyzing which option might be best, they analyze what it would take to make any reasonable option work. That shift in focus changes everything. The anxiety most people feel around decisions comes from a hidden assumption that the right choice will lead to success and the wrong choice will lead to failure. This assumption is almost entirely false. The outcome of a decision depends far more on what you do after the decision than on the decision itself. Two people can make the exact same choice, take the same job, start the same type of business, move to the same city, and end up in completely different places based on how they responded to what happened next. Treating decisions as pass-fail tests gives them power they do not deserve and takes power away from where it actually belongs, your capacity to adapt, adjust, and persist after the choice is made. High achievers filter decisions through a specific set of questions that most people never think to ask. These questions do not require hours of deliberation. They can be processed in minutes, sometimes seconds, once you know what to look for. The value of these questions is not that they produce perfect answers. The value is that they cut through the noise that keeps most people frozen. The filtering process begins with a question that sounds almost too simple. What am I actually deciding here? This question matters because most decision paralysis comes from conflating multiple decisions into a single overwhelming choice. The person who cannot decide whether to change careers is usually not making one decision. They are unconsciously bundling dozens of decisions together and then feeling crushed by the combined weight. Should I leave my job? What industry should I enter? What role should I pursue? Where should I work? How will I handle the income gap? What will people think? Each of these is a separate decision, and only one of them needs to be made right now. High achievers are skilled at unbundling these clusters and identifying which single decision is actually in front of them at this moment. Everything else gets set aside until its time comes. The second filtering question is this: what happens if I make this decision and I am wrong? This question forces a realistic assessment of actual consequences rather than imagined catastrophes. Most fears around decisions are vague. A general sense that something bad will happen if we choose incorrectly. Specifying what that something bad actually is almost always reveals that the consequences are more manageable than the fear suggested. Getting specific also reveals which decisions genuinely warrant careful consideration and which do not. The decision about whether to post that social media update has entirely different downside stakes than the decision about whether to take a job in a new city. Both might generate anxiety, but only one of them has consequences worth significant deliberation. The third question reverses the lens. What is the cost of not deciding? Most people never ask this question, and the failure to ask it is responsible for more stuckness than any other factor. Every day that a decision remains unmade carries a cost. Sometimes that cost is obvious. Money spent on rent in a city you want to leave. Time invested in a project you know you should abandon. Sometimes the cost is subtle. The mental bandwidth consumed by an open loop. the erosion of self-trust that comes from chronic indecision, the opportunity cost of not being able to commit fully to anything because something else is still unresolved. When you quantify the cost of inaction, decisions that seemed optional often reveal themselves as urgent. The fourth question brings focus to the present. What would I need to believe to make this decision today? This question exposes the hidden requirements you have placed on yourself before you will allow yourself to choose. Often these requirements are impossible to meet. I would need to know for certain that this will work out. I would need a guarantee that I will not regret this. I would need to feel completely ready. High achievers recognize these impossible requirements for what they are: avoidance dressed up as prudence. By making the requirements explicit, you can then examine them. Is this requirement reasonable? Is it possible to meet? If not, are you willing to make the decision without it? The distinction between genuine caution and disguised avoidance is critical, and most people have no reliable way to tell them apart. Disguised avoidance feels like caution. It sounds reasonable. It uses sensible language about being careful, doing due diligence, waiting for the right moment. But the function of disguised avoidance is not to improve the decision. It is to delay the decision indefinitely while maintaining the appearance of responsibility. There are specific patterns that reveal when caution has become avoidance. The most obvious is repeated delay without new information. Genuine caution pauses a decision to gather specific information that would change the analysis. Once that information is gathered, the decision gets made. Disguised avoidance pauses a decision and then does not actually gather any new information, or gathers information and then finds new reasons to delay again. If you have delayed a decision multiple times and cannot point to specific new data you acquired during each delay, you are not being cautious. You are avoiding. Moving the goalposts is a more subtle pattern that signals avoidance. This happens when you tell yourself you will make a decision once a certain condition is met, and then once that condition is met, a new condition appears that must be met first. I will decide after I talk to 3 people who have done this. You talk to 3 people. I should probably talk to 2 more, just to be safe. This goalpost movement can continue indefinitely, and the person doing it rarely recognizes what is happening. They feel like they are being thorough. They are actually running an avoidance loop that will never terminate. Perfectionism often masquerades as high standards. The perfectionist delays decisions because no option is good enough, because there might be a better option they have not discovered yet, because they do not want to commit to anything less than ideal. What perfectionism actually produces is paralysis. The perfect option does not exist, and waiting for it is not a strategy. It is a way of ensuring that nothing happens while feeling justified about the inaction. High achievers are not perfectionists. They are satisficers when it comes to decisions. They identify options that are good enough to move forward, and then they move forward. They know that execution quality matters more than selection quality. Fear of regret is perhaps the most powerful driver of disguised avoidance. The person paralyzed by a decision is often not actually afraid of the outcome. They are afraid of how they will feel about themselves if the outcome is bad and they chose it. This fear of future self-judgment keeps people frozen between options, and it creates a tragic irony. The attempt to avoid regret guarantees it. You will regret the decisions you never made, far more than the decisions you made that turned out poorly. Inaction feels safe, but it produces its own regret. The regret of the unlived life, the paths not taken, the person you never got to become because you could not commit to a direction. The cost of inaction is almost always underestimated because it is distributed rather than concentrated. When you make a decision that turns out badly, the negative consequences tend to be specific and obvious. You can point to them, you can feel them. When you fail to make a decision, the consequences spread out across time and become invisible. The opportunity you did not pursue does not send you a rejection letter. The business you did not start does not go bankrupt in a way you can observe. The relationship you did not end just slowly consumes more of your life without any single dramatic moment. This distribution makes the cost of inaction easy to ignore, but the cost is real, and in most cases it far exceeds the cost of a wrong decision. High achievers develop the habit of calculating inaction costs explicitly. They ask themselves, if I do not make this decision for another month, what will that month cost me? The calculation includes tangible costs like time and money. It includes opportunity costs. What else could you do with the mental bandwidth currently consumed by this unmade decision? It includes psychological costs. How does carrying this open loop affect your energy, your focus, your relationship with yourself? And it includes trajectory costs. How does another month of inaction affect the longer arc of your life? This calculation changes the emotional framing of decisions entirely. Most people feel that making a decision is risky and not making a decision is safe. When you calculate the cost of inaction, you realize that both options carry risk. Choosing has risks. Not choosing has different risks. The question is not whether to accept risk, you cannot avoid it, but which risks you prefer to take. Framed this way, decisions become easier. You are not choosing between safety and danger. You are choosing between two different risk profiles. Often the risks of inaction, when honestly calculated, dwarf the risks of making a suboptimal choice. Making decisions faster does not mean making them carelessly. Speed and care are not opposites. They are both skills that can operate together. What makes fast decisions possible without sacrificing quality is having a reliable process that handles most of the work automatically. Same-day decision-making becomes possible when you adopt a simple practice. For any decision that does not have irreversible consequences, commit to resolving it within 24 hours of recognizing that a decision is needed. This deadline is not arbitrary. It is short enough to prevent the kind of rumination that masquerades as thoughtfulness, and long enough to allow for genuine consideration of the options. The 24-hour practice works because of a principle most people get backwards. Time spent on a decision has diminishing returns almost immediately. The first few minutes of considering a decision produce enormous value. You identify the options, recognize the stakes, and notice any obvious problems. The next few hours produce some additional value as you think through implications and perhaps gather relevant information. Beyond that, additional time produces almost nothing. The person who spends 2 weeks on a decision is not making a better decision than the person who spends 2 hours. They are just generating more anxiety and delaying the learning that only action provides. There are exceptions. Decisions with irreversible consequences warrant more time, though even here people typically overestimate how much time is helpful. Decisions that affect other people significantly may require coordination that extends the timeline. Decisions that require information you do not currently have and cannot quickly obtain deserve patience. But these exceptions are rarer than most people assume. The vast majority of decisions in life are reversible, affect primarily yourself, and can be made with information you already possess or can gather quickly. These decisions do not deserve days or weeks of deliberation. They deserve a decision. Part of what makes fast decisions possible is giving yourself permission to be wrong. This sounds obvious, but represents a profound shift for most people. The hidden assumption behind slow decision-making is that if you think long enough, you can avoid making a wrong choice. This assumption is false. No amount of thinking can eliminate the possibility of being wrong because you cannot know things you cannot know. Future circumstances, other people's reactions, your own feelings after the choice is made. These factors are genuinely uncertain and cannot be resolved through additional deliberation. What you can do is develop confidence in your ability to handle being wrong. This is a completely different kind of confidence than confidence in being right. Confidence in being right is fragile because reality constantly challenges it. Confidence in your ability to handle being wrong is robust because it is based on a skill you can actually develop. Every time you make a decision, observe the outcome, and respond effectively, you build this skill. Every time you change course after receiving new information, you prove to yourself that wrong decisions are not fatal. They are just information about what to try next. High achievers share this characteristic. They would rather make a fast decision and correct course than make a slow decision and be right the first time. This preference is not about impulsiveness. It is about understanding how learning works. Mistakes made quickly can be corrected quickly. They generate information early, when there is still time to use it. Mistakes made after long deliberation feel more consequential because of all the time invested, but they are often harder to correct because the delay has narrowed the available options. The practical application of everything in this chapter comes down to implementation. Knowing how high achievers make decisions is worthless if you continue making decisions the way you always have. What follows is a same-day method for reaching decisions that can be applied to any choice you are currently facing. Begin by writing down the decision in a single sentence. Force yourself to be specific. Not figure out my career situation, but decide whether to apply for the senior position at my current company. The act of writing forces clarity and exposés when you are actually bundling multiple decisions together. If you cannot state the decision in a single sentence, you have not yet identified what you are actually deciding. Write out your options. Most decisions have fewer genuine options than they initially appear to have. List them without evaluating them. Include the option of doing nothing, which is always a choice even when it does not feel like one. For most decisions, you will have between 2 and 4 real options. If you have more than that, you may be overcomplicating the decision or conflating separate decisions. For each option, answer in writing, what is the realistic worst case if I choose this? Realistic means probable, not possible. It is possible that applying for a job could lead to a series of events that destroys your career, but it is not probable. Focus on what is likely to happen if things go badly, not what could theoretically happen in an extreme scenario. Then answer, what is the cost of not deciding this today? Include every cost you can think of: financial, psychological, opportunity-related. Be specific. Quantify where possible. Review your answers. In most cases, this process will take less than 20 minutes and will make the right choice obvious. The option that seemed terrifying often reveals itself as manageable when the worst case is specified. The option that seemed safe often reveals itself as expensive when the cost of inaction is calculated. The clarity you were waiting to feel arrives, not through more thinking, but through structured thinking that targets the right questions. Make the decision. Do not give yourself time to second guess. The analysis is complete. Additional deliberation will not improve the outcome. Write down what you have decided. Tell someone about it if possible, and take any immediate action that moves you in the chosen direction. Action cements commitment in a way that thinking alone cannot. What you are training when you practice fast decision-making is not impulsiveness. You are training a specific skill, the ability to reach commitment quickly without sacrificing quality of thought. This skill compounds over time. Each decision made builds capacity for the next. Each commitment honored builds self-trust. Each course correction after a wrong decision builds confidence in your ability to adapt. The mental gap between wanting success and achieving it runs directly through how you make decisions. People who stay stuck treat decisions as problems to be solved through more thinking. People who achieve treat decisions as thresholds to be crossed so that learning can begin. The 4-question filter, the cost of inaction calculation, the same-day decision practice, these are not theoretical concepts. They are tools you can begin using immediately, starting with whatever decision is currently consuming your mental bandwidth. Your capacity to decide is the engine that turns intentions into outcomes. Everything you want to accomplish requires decisions, and the quality of your life will be determined far more by how quickly you decide than by whether you decide correctly. The time spent frozen between options is time not spent learning, not spent growing, not spent becoming the person who achieves what you set out to achieve. That time is not coming back, and every day the cost of inaction increases while the best opportunities move further out of reach. Chapter 3. What failure actually means to people who succeed. Failure does not care about your potential. It does not adjust itself based on how hard you tried or how much the outcome meant to you. Failure arrives without explanation, without fairness, and without any consideration for the plans you had made. What happens next? in the hours and days after something goes wrong, determines more about your future than the failure itself ever could. The difference between people who achieve consistently and people who struggle is not that achievers fail less often. They frequently fail more because they attempt more and risk more. The difference is what their minds do with failure once it happens. Most people process setbacks through a mental framework that amplifies the damage, extends the recovery time, and increases the likelihood of future failure. High achievers process the identical experience through a completely different framework, one that extracts useful information, preserves forward momentum, and makes the next attempt stronger rather than weaker. This is not about positive thinking, telling yourself that failure is actually success in disguise or that everything happens for a reason does nothing to address the real problem. The real problem is that your automatic mental response to failure was programmed by people and experiences that had no interest in your long-term achievement. That programming runs every time something goes wrong, and it produces outputs that feel like insight but function like sabotage. What you think and do in the 48 hours after a setback will either compound the damage or begin converting it into something useful. Most people have never been taught how to manage those 48 hours intentionally. The mental framework most people use to process failure follows a predictable pattern. Something goes wrong. The mind immediately asks, "What does this mean about me?" That question feels natural. It feels like the obvious thing to wonder, but it is the exact wrong question to ask, and asking it triggers a cascade of mental activity that makes everything worse. When you ask what a failure means about you, you activate a part of your mind that specializes in finding confirming evidence for negative conclusions. The human brain is exceptionally good at this. Within seconds of asking the question, your mind will surface memories of other times you failed, evidence that you are not as capable as you thought, reasons why this outcome was probably inevitable given who you are. This evidence feels true because it is real. You really did fail those other times. You really do have limitations, but the question itself has biased the search. You have asked your brain to build a case against yourself, and your brain has obliged. High achievers ask a different question. When something goes wrong, their minds go to, "What happened here specifically?" This question sounds similar but produces radically different mental activity. It directs attention outward rather than inward, toward the event rather than toward identity. It triggers analysis rather than self-judgment. It opens the possibility that failure was caused by factors that can be changed rather than by permanent deficiencies in the person who failed. The shift from "what does this mean about me" to "what happened here" is simple to understand and extremely difficult to execute in the moment. Failure hurts. The pain triggers protective responses. Those protective responses feel like they are helping but are actually deepening the wound. Learning to override them requires both understanding why they happen and practicing a different response until it becomes automatic. Why does the mind default to self-judgment after failure? The answer lies in how psychological protection the systems work. When you experience a setback, your brain registers it as a threat, not a physical threat, but a social and psychological one. Failure suggests that you are not as competent as you believed, which threatens your status, your self-image, and your predictions about the future. The brain responds to this threat the same way it responds to all threats, by trying to establish control and certainty as quickly as possible. Self-judgment is a strange form of control-seeking. When you conclude that failure happened because of something fundamentally wrong with you, you have explained the event. The explanation is painful, but it provides certainty. The alternative, accepting that failure sometimes happens for complex reasons that cannot be easily understood, leaves you without an explanation, without certainty, and without the feeling that you understand what went wrong. The brain finds this uncertainty intolerable, so it generates the fastest available explanation, which usually involves blaming you. This protective mechanism was useful in ancestral environments where quick conclusions about what went wrong could prevent future danger. If you ate a berry and got sick, concluding that the berry was poison and never eating it again made sense. But personal failure in modern life is rarely that simple. Concluding that your presentation failed because you are bad at presenting does not actually prevent future presentation failures. It just makes you afraid of presentations. The protective mechanism has overreached. It has taken a complex event with multiple contributing factors and reduced it to a simple, stable, internal attribution that protects against uncertainty but cripples future attempts. Separating what happened from what it means is the essential skill for processing failure productively. These are two different questions, and most people answer the second before they have adequately answered the first. What happened is a factual reconstruction of events. What it means is an interpretation layered on top of those facts. High achievers spend far more time on the first question and approach the second question with much more skepticism. Consider a business pitch that fails to secure funding. The facts might include: the presentation lasted 12 minutes. 3 of the 5 decision makers appeared disengaged during the middle section. 2 questions were asked about financial projections. The response to those questions seemed to land poorly. The rejection email arrived 3 days later. These are facts. They are observable, specific, and neutral. The meaning layered on top might be: I am not cut out for this. My idea is not good enough. I will never be able to raise money. Investors can tell I do not know what I am doing. These are interpretations. They may or may not be accurate. They feel true because they follow emotionally from the experience. But feelings are not evidence. The discipline of separating facts from interpretations is harder than it sounds, because interpretations arrive automatically and feel like facts themselves. When you conclude that investors can tell you do not know what you are doing, that conclusion does not announce itself as an interpretation. It feels like a perception, like something you observed. Recognizing it as an added layer, a story you have constructed on top of limited data, requires deliberate mental effort. 3 questions can turn any setback into usable information. These questions work because they direct attention toward factors that can be changed, while preventing the mind from spiraling into self-judgment and hopelessness. The first question is, what specifically went wrong? Not what went wrong in general, not how you feel about what went wrong. The specific observable moments where the outcome diverged from what you wanted. This question forces granularity. Most people think about failure in broad strokes. It did not work. They said no. I failed. But broad strokes are useless for learning. You cannot fix it did not work. You can fix specific elements that contributed to the outcome. Answering this question well requires breaking the event into components and identifying which components underperformed. A job interview that did not result in an offer is not a single event. It is a collection of moments: the greeting, the responses to specific questions, the questions you asked, the rapport with each interviewer, the closing. Which of these components were strong? Which were weak? What evidence do you have for these assessments? The goal is to move from "I bombed the interview" to "My answer to the question about conflict resolution was vague and generic, and I noticed the interviewer's engagement drop immediately after." The second question is, what factors contributed to this, and which of them are within my control? Every failure has multiple causes. Some are internal: your preparation, your skills, your choices. Some are external: timing, competition, other people's decisions, circumstances you could not influence. Most people either blame themselves entirely, which is demoralizing and often inaccurate, or blame circumstances entirely, which protects the ego but prevents learning. The accurate answer almost always involves both internal and external factors. Identifying which factors are within your control matters, because those are the only factors worth focusing on. Ruminating about external factors you cannot change is a waste of mental energy. But denying that internal factors played any role prevents you from making adjustments that would improve future outcomes. The goal is to identify 1 to 3 internal factors that contributed to the failure and that you could realistically change or improve. The third question is, what would I do differently if I faced this same situation tomorrow? This question forces practical thinking and cuts through the emotional fog that surrounds failure. It shifts mental energy from the past to the future, from analysis to action planning. Even if you never face the exact same situation again, The act of generating specific adjustments keeps your mind oriented toward improvement rather than rumination. These 3 questions, what specifically went wrong, what factors contributed and which are controllable, what would I do differently, form a complete protocol for extracting value from any setback. Working through them takes 10 to 15 minutes. That investment prevents hours or days of unproductive rumination and converts painful experience into useful information. The 48 hours following a significant failure constitute a critical window. What happens during this window influences whether the failure becomes an isolated event or the beginning of a downward pattern. Most people spend this window doing the worst possible things, replaying the failure repeatedly, generating increasingly negative interpretations, withdrawing from activity, and marinating in emotions that deepen rather than resolve. High achievers manage these 48 hours intentionally. Their protocol involves several key practices that prevent the normal spiral and accelerate productive processing. The first practice is allowing the emotional response without feeding it. Failure hurts. Pretending it does not hurt or trying to immediately suppress the emotion does not work and often backfires. Emotions need acknowledgement, but there is a significant difference between feeling an emotion and actively amplifying it. Replaying the failure mentally, telling the story to multiple people, focusing on the most painful aspects, these activities feel like processing but actually intensify and prolong the emotional response. Allowing the emotion means letting yourself feel disappointed, frustrated, or upset without adding fuel. It means sitting with the feeling rather than either suppressing it or dramatizing it. The second practice is delaying interpretation for at least 24 hours. Your mind will urgently want to explain what happened. It will generate interpretations immediately, and those interpretations will feel obviously true. These immediate interpretations are almost always wrong, not because your mind is lying to you, but because it is working with incomplete information and elevated emotion. The explanations that feel compelling at hour 2 will often seem ridiculous at hour 48. High achievers have learned not to trust their early interpretations. They acknowledge that their mind is generating explanations and treat those explanations as hypotheses to be tested later rather than conclusions to be accepted now. The third practice is doing something unrelated within the first several hours, not to distract from or avoid the failure, but to break the rumination cycle and restore perspective. Physical activity works especially well for this purpose. So does any engaging task that requires focus. The goal is not to forget what happened, but to prevent the mind from entering a loop where the same thoughts repeat without producing any new insight. The fourth practice is working through the 3 questions. What specifically went wrong? What factors contributed and which are controllable? What would I do differently? At some point between 24 and 48 hours after the failure. This timing matters. Before 24 hours, emotions are usually too elevated for productive analysis. After 48 hours, the experience begins to fade and the motivation to learn from it diminishes. The 24 to 48 hour window is the sweet spot where emotions have settled enough for clear thinking, but the experience is still fresh enough to remember details accurately. Most failure responses make the next failure more likely. This counterintuitive truth explains why some people seem to fail repeatedly while others bounce back and succeed. The failure itself is not what creates the pattern. The response to failure is what creates the pattern. Consider what happens when someone processes failure by concluding that they are fundamentally not good at something. That conclusion affects everything that follows. The person approaches their next attempt with less confidence, which affects their preparation. They interpret ambiguous signals during the attempt as confirmation that they are failing again. When the attempt ends, regardless of the actual outcome, they are primed to see whatever went wrong as further evidence for their negative conclusion. Each iteration strengthens the belief, and the belief influences performance in ways that generate confirming evidence. Breaking this cycle requires intervening at the interpretation stage. The conclusion, "I am not good at this," is an interpretation, not a fact. It may or may not be accurate. Even if there is some truth to it, framing the issue as a stable internal characteristic prevents the kind of targeted improvement that could change the situation. Alternative interpretations are almost always available. My preparation for that specific attempt was inadequate. I have not yet developed certain skills that this task requires. The approach I used was not well suited to this context. These interpretations may be less emotionally satisfying. They do not provide the certainty that self-blame provides, but they are more likely to be accurate and far more useful for future attempts. The goal is not to deny responsibility or make excuses. Taking responsibility for failure is appropriate and necessary, but responsibility for an outcome is different from concluding that you are fundamentally limited. You can take responsibility for a failed presentation while recognizing that presentation skill is something you can develop. You can own a business failure while understanding that the specific decisions you made can inform better decisions in the future. Responsibility with a growth orientation feels different than responsibility with a fixed orientation, and the long-term outcomes of these two orientations diverge dramatically. A common mistake is treating all failures as equal opportunities for learning. They are not. Some failures contain significant usable information. Others contain very little. Knowing which is which prevents wasted analysis on failures that have nothing to teach while ensuring that high-value failures get the attention they deserve. High-information failures share certain characteristics. They happened despite adequate preparation and genuine effort. The outcome was within your control to influence, at least partially. The failure can be traced to specific decisions or actions rather than pure bad luck or circumstances. The situation is likely to repeat in some form, making the lessons applicable to future attempts. Low-information failures have different characteristics. They resulted from external factors you could not have influenced or predicted. The outcome was essentially random or dependent on other people's subjective preferences. The situation is unlikely to repeat. The failure would have happened regardless of what you did differently. Spending hours analyzing a low-information failure is not productive. Sometimes you did everything right, and things still did not work out. Sometimes decisions were made based on factors you had no access to. Sometimes the outcome was simply not yours to control. In these cases, the appropriate response is to acknowledge the failure, check for any genuine lessons, and move forward without extensive analysis. Forcing lessons from experiences that have none to offer produces false conclusions that can actually harm future performance. High-information failures, by contrast, deserve serious attention. These are the failures where detailed analysis pays off, where the 3 questions reveal genuinely useful insights, where the investment of time in understanding what went wrong produces returns in future attempts. Recognizing which failures fall into which category allows you to allocate your mental energy efficiently. Processing failure productively is a skill, which means it improves with practice. The first few times you try to separate facts from interpretations, your mind will resist. The pull toward self-judgment is strong, and the alternative feels less natural. The first few times you delay interpretation for 24 hours, you will notice your mind generating explanations urgently, insisting that you need to understand right now what went wrong. This resistance is normal and decreases with repetition. Each time you work through a failure using the protocol, allowing the emotion, delaying interpretation, breaking rumination, asking the 3 questions, you strengthen new mental habits and weaken old ones. After enough repetitions, productive failure processing starts to feel more natural. The automatic self-judgment still arises, but you recognize it more quickly as a default rather than as truth. The urge to ruminate still appears, but you have experienced enough times the difference between rumination and genuine analysis to know which is which. Building this skill happens one failure at a time. Each setback becomes a training opportunity. This reframe does not make failure painless. Nothing makes failure painless, but it adds a layer of purpose that makes the experience more bearable. The failure itself may not have been worthwhile, how you respond to it can be. The mental framework high achievers use for processing failure rests on a fundamental belief that failure is temporary and specific rather than permanent and global. Temporary means that this outcome does not determine all future outcomes. Specific means that this failure reflects particular factors in this particular situation rather than a general truth about who you are and what you are capable of. Most people hold the opposite belief, even if they would not articulate it that way. When they fail, they feel as if they have learned something permanent about themselves and their prospects. The feeling is powerful and convincing. Overriding it requires not just knowing that it is inaccurate, but practicing a different response until the new belief becomes more automatic than the old one. Failure will continue to arrive for as long as you continue to attempt things that matter. This is not pessimism, but simple acknowledgement of how achievement works. The question is not whether you will fail, but whether you will process failure in ways that make you stronger or weaker for the next attempt. The protocol and principles in this chapter give you a concrete answer to that question, a way of handling setbacks that extracts maximum learning while minimizing the psychological damage that prevents future effort. Putting these practices to use transforms failure from an enemy into a teacher, difficult and unwelcome, but undeniably useful for the person committed to getting better. Chapter 4. Installing these patterns permanently, knowing how successful people think will not change your life. That statement may seem strange. After 3 chapters explaining exactly how high achievers process decisions, handle failure, and interpret reality differently than everyone else. But knowledge alone has never transformed anyone. Libraries are full of brilliant ideas that never improved a single reader's circumstances. The graveyard of self-improvement is packed with people who understood exactly what they needed to do and never managed to do it consistently. Understanding is necessary but radically insufficient. What separates lasting change from temporary insight comes down to a single distinction: whether new thinking patterns become automatic or remain conscious efforts. Conscious effort is exhausting. It depletes willpower, demands constant attention, and collapses the moment life becomes stressful or busy. Automatic patterns run without effort. They operate in the background, shaping your responses to situations before you even realize a response was required. The goal of this chapter is not to give you more things to think about, but to show you how to install achievement-oriented thinking so deeply that it becomes how you naturally operate. Not something you have to remember to do, but something that happens whether you are paying attention or not. The difference between people who read books like this and actually change versus those who feel inspired for a few days and then return to old patterns comes down to installation. Ideas that are not installed remain visitors in your mind, interesting guests who eventually leave. Ideas that are installed become permanent residents that shape how you perceive and respond to everything. The protocols in this chapter are not optional additions to the concepts in previous chapters. They are what make those concepts real in your actual life. Most attempts at mental change fail not because the new pattern is wrong, but because the installation process is fundamentally misunderstood. People assume that repetition is the key, that if you think a new thought enough times, it will become automatic. This assumption is half right, and the half that is wrong explains why most mindset work produces temporary results at best. Repetition matters, but repetition without emotional engagement produces almost nothing. You can repeat an affirmation 10,000 times and feel no different because the repetition never engaged the parts of your brain responsible for automatic responses. Those parts do not update based on words, they update based on experiences. Specifically, experiences that carry emotional weight. This is why traumatic events can install new patterns instantly, while years of positive self-talk may produce no lasting change. The trauma carried emotional intensity that forced the brain to update its predictions about the world. The self-talk carried no intensity at all. The goal is not to create trauma, obviously. The goal is to understand what actually drives installation so that you can create conditions where new patterns take hold. Emotional engagement is the first requirement. A new thought pattern must feel meaningful, must connect to something you actually care about, must carry enough weight that your brain registers it as important. Reading about how high achievers make decisions will not install the pattern. Making an important decision using that framework, feeling the discomfort and then the relief, noticing the outcome, that has a chance of installing something. Repetition with emotional engagement is the second requirement. A single powerful experience can install a pattern, but most patterns require multiple reinforcing experiences before they become truly automatic. The key word is reinforcing. Each repetition must build on previous repetitions, and each must carry enough emotional engagement to register as significant. 10 repetitions with genuine engagement install more deeply than 100 repetitions done mechanically. The third requirement is what makes everything else work. The new pattern must prove itself useful in real situations. Your brain is not interested in adopting patterns because they sound good or because a book recommended them. Your brain adopts patterns because they help you get what you want. When a new thinking pattern produces a better outcome than your old pattern would have, and you notice that it produced a better outcome, your brain has a reason to keep it. Without this proof of usefulness, even emotionally engaging repetitions will fade over time. Why willpower fails for lasting mental change is worth understanding, because most people rely on willpower without realizing it. They read about a new way of thinking, commit to trying it, and then use conscious effort to override their old patterns whenever those patterns arise. This approach works for a while. It can work for days or even weeks if motivation is high. But it cannot work forever, because willpower is a limited resource that depletes with use. Every time you consciously override an automatic pattern, you spend some of your available mental energy. That energy replenishes with rest, but never fast enough to sustain continuous overriding indefinitely. Eventually, a day comes when you are tired, stressed, distracted, or simply not paying attention, and on that day, the old pattern runs without opposition. Once the old pattern runs, it gets reinforced. Once it gets reinforced, you are back where you started or close to it. The solution is not more willpower. The solution is making the new pattern automatic so that willpower is no longer required. When a pattern is truly automatic, it runs without conscious effort, without mental energy expenditure, without requiring you to remember to do it. This is why installation matters so much. Installed patterns do not compete with willpower. They operate on a different system entirely. The same system that allows you to drive a car while having a conversation, or brush your teeth while thinking about your day. The transition from conscious effort to automatic pattern is not instant. It happens gradually through the process described above, emotionally engaged repetition that proves itself useful in real situations. During the transition period, willpower is still required. The key is to use that willpower strategically to focus it on creating the conditions for installation rather than on trying to maintain conscious effort indefinitely. 3 conditions must be present for new thought patterns to override old ones and become the default way your mind operates. These conditions work together. Missing any one of them dramatically reduces the likelihood of lasting change. The first condition is pattern recognition in real time. You cannot change a response if you do not notice the response is happening. Most automatic patterns operate beneath conscious awareness. The thought appears, the emotion follows, the behavior results, all before you realize anything has occurred. Installing a new pattern requires developing the ability to catch the old pattern in action, to notice when it is running and create a gap between stimulus and response where a different choice becomes possible. This recognition ability develops through deliberate attention. You train yourself to notice specific triggers and automatic responses by deciding in advance what you are looking for. If you want to change how you respond to criticism, you pay attention to moments when criticism arrives and observe what happens in your mind during those moments. The observation itself begins to create distance. Instead of being completely identified with your automatic response, you develop a part of your awareness that watches the response happen. That watching creates the space for intervention. The second condition is a clear alternative response that is ready to deploy. Catching an old pattern is useless if you have nothing to replace it with. The moment you notice yourself thinking in the old way, you need to know exactly what the new way looks like. This means the new pattern must be defined specifically enough that it can be executed without deliberation. If you catch yourself asking, "What does this failure mean about me?" and want to shift to asking what specifically went wrong, that shift must be so practiced that it happens smoothly, without requiring you to think about what you should be thinking about. The third condition is immediate application followed by outcome observation. When you notice an old pattern, interrupt it, and deploy the new pattern, you must then pay attention to what happens as a result. Did the new pattern produce a better outcome? Did it feel more useful? Did it move you toward what you wanted? This observation closes the loop and provides the evidence your brain needs to favor the new pattern going forward. Skipping this observation step, interrupting the old pattern, deploying the new one, and then moving on without noticing the result, eliminates the learning signal that drives installation. Building the pattern recognition ability deserves more attention because it is where most people fail before they even begin trying to change. Automatic patterns are automatic precisely because they do not announce themselves. They feel like reality, not like responses to reality. When you interpret a setback as evidence of your limitations, that interpretation does not arrive with a label saying, "This is an automatic pattern that you could potentially change." It arrives feeling true, obvious, like a direct perception, rather than a constructed response. Developing recognition requires something like meditation, though you do not need to meditate to do it. What meditation teaches is the ability to observe your own mind, to watch thoughts arise without immediately being absorbed by them. That observational capacity is exactly what pattern recognition requires. You need enough mental distance from your automatic responses to see them as responses rather than as facts. Practical methods for developing this capacity include setting specific intention before high-stakes situations. Before giving a presentation, you might tell yourself, "I am going to pay attention to what my mind does if questions are challenging." Before having a difficult conversation, you might decide, "I want to notice my automatic interpretations of what the other person says." These intentions prime your attention to catch patterns that would otherwise run invisibly. Post-situation review also builds recognition over time. After a significant event, you can reconstruct what happened in your mind. What thoughts arose? What interpretations did you make? What emotions followed? Doing this review repeatedly calibrates your awareness. You start to see patterns across situations, the same kinds of thoughts arising in response to the same kinds of triggers. Once you can see the pattern in retrospect, you become better at seeing it in real time. Preparing clear alternative responses means defining, in advance and with specificity, exactly what you want your mind to do instead of what it currently does. This is not a general intention like, "Think more positively." General intentions are useless in the moment of activation. When an old pattern fires, you have a brief window to interrupt and redirect. That window does not accommodate deliberation. The alternative must be specified clearly enough that it can be deployed instantly. The content of these alternative responses depends on what patterns you are trying to change. If you are working on decision-making patterns from the second chapter, your alternative response might be the 4-question filter, immediately asking what you are actually deciding, what happens if you are wrong, what the cost of not deciding is, and what you would need to believe to decide today. If you are working on failure processing from the third chapter, your alternative response might be the 3 questions: what specifically went wrong, what factors contributed, and which are controllable, what you would do differently. Writing these alternatives down matters more than you might expect. The act of writing forces precision. It reveals vague spots in your understanding. It creates a reference you can review and refine over time, and the writing process itself begins the installation. Your brain handles written material differently than merely thought material. Committing your alternative responses to writing gives them a kind of reality they do not have as abstractions floating in your mind. Practicing these alternatives mentally before you need them also accelerates installation. Mental rehearsal, visualizing a trigger, imagining your old pattern arising, and then walking through the deployment of your new pattern builds the neural pathways that real-time execution will require. Athletes use this kind of visualization to improve performance without physical practice. The same principle applies to mental patterns. Each mental rehearsal counts as a repetition, and because you can control the conditions of mental rehearsal, these repetitions can be engineered to carry emotional engagement. The daily structure for reinforcing achievement-oriented thinking takes less than 10 minutes and consists of 3 components. These components work together to create the conditions for pattern installation without requiring hours of meditation or reflection. The first component is morning intention setting, which takes 2 to 3 minutes. Before starting your day, you identify the 1 or 2 situations most likely to trigger old patterns that day. Maybe you have a meeting where criticism is likely. Maybe you need to make a decision you have been avoiding. Maybe you are working on a project where setbacks are probable. For each situation, you briefly recall the alternative response you want to deploy and visualize yourself deploying it. This priming makes it far more likely that you will catch the old pattern when it arises and have the alternative ready. This second component is micro check-ins, which take a few seconds each and happen several times throughout the day. At natural transition points, finishing a task, moving between locations, taking a break, you pause briefly and ask, what patterns ran in the last hour? Were any of them old patterns I am trying to change? This question might reveal that you processed a minor setback using old interpretations, that you delayed a small decision unnecessarily, that you asked what something meant about you rather than what specifically happened. These realizations do not require extended analysis. You simply notice, acknowledge, and remind yourself of the alternative. Over time, this frequent noticing dramatically accelerates pattern recognition. The third component is evening review, which takes 3 to 5 minutes. Before ending your day, you run through the key moments when patterns were relevant. Where did you catch an old pattern and successfully deploy an alternative? Where did an old pattern run without intervention? Where did you notice an old pattern midstream and partially redirect? Each of these instances contains information. Successes reinforce the new pattern and build confidence in your ability to change. Partial successes show progress and reveal where attention is still needed. Failures identify triggers that are particularly strong and may need additional preparation. This daily structure works because it creates multiple touch points with the change process without consuming significant time. Most people who try to change mental patterns either do nothing structured at all or attempt ambitious practices that they cannot sustain. 10 minutes per day falls in the sustainable zone. Brief enough to happen consistently, substantive enough to make a difference. The 30-day protocol for making achievement-oriented patterns permanent structures the installation process into phases that reflect how pattern change actually works. These phases are not arbitrary divisions but correspond to real shifts in how your brain handles new patterns. Days 1 through 7 focus on awareness building. During this phase, the goal is not to change anything, but to observe with precision what is already happening. You are mapping your existing patterns, noticing when they arise, what triggers them, what they produce. You use the daily structure with emphasis on the observation components. You may catch old patterns and interrupt them occasionally, but the primary goal is reconnaissance, not combat. This phase prevents the common mistake of trying to change something you do not yet adequately understand. Days 8 through 14 shift to active intervention. Now that you know your patterns intimately, you begin deliberately interrupting them and deploying alternatives. This phase is the most effortful. You will feel like you are constantly catching yourself, constantly redirecting, constantly having to remember what you are trying to do. This effort is necessary and temporary. It represents the transition period where willpower is still required because the new pattern is not yet automatic. The daily structure during this phase emphasizes the intention-setting component in the morning and adds more frequent micro check-ins to catch patterns closer to real time. Days 15 through 21 focus on refinement. By now, pattern recognition is becoming faster and alternative deployment is becoming smoother. The effort level decreases noticeably. Old patterns still arise, but they feel less compelling, more like suggestions than commands. New patterns start to feel more natural, less like something you are doing, and more like something you are. During this phase, the evening review becomes particularly valuable because you can now identify subtle variations, situations where the new pattern works well, and situations where it still struggles. Days 22 through 30 are about consolidation. The new patterns are functional but not yet deeply installed. They could still fade if attention is withdrawn. During this phase, you maintain the daily structure while gradually reducing the intensity of attention. You are testing whether the patterns persist without heavy support. Some slippage is normal and not cause for alarm. The goal is not perfection but persistence, new patterns that operate most of the time without conscious effort. Obstacles will arise during this 30-day period, and knowing what to expect reduces the likelihood of abandonment. The most common obstacle is inconsistency in performing the daily structure. Life interferes. Mornings get rushed. Evenings get consumed by other demands. Missing a day or two is normal and not damaging. Missing multiple days in a row is damaging because it breaks the rhythm of attention that installation requires. The solution is to treat the daily structure as non-negotiable, in the same way that brushing your teeth is non-negotiable. It happens not because you feel like it, but because it is simply what you do. If you miss a day, you resume the next day without self-judgment and without trying to make up for lost time. Frustration with the pace of change is also common. People expect to feel different quickly and become discouraged when old patterns keep arising. Understanding the installation timeline helps with this frustration. Weeks 1 and 2 are not supposed to feel easy. Old patterns are supposed to keep arising during this phase because you are still in active intervention. The ease comes later, not through giving up, but through persistent practice that gradually shifts the burden from conscious effort to automatic execution. The illusion of completion around day 14 or 15 catches many people off guard. At this point, patterns are improved enough that change feels accomplished. The temptation to discontinue the daily structure and declare victory is strong. But patterns that feel installed at week 2 are not actually installed. They are merely practiced. Stopping at this point almost guarantees regression. The remaining 2 weeks are what convert practice patterns into permanent patterns. Skipping them means starting over eventually. Regression during times of stress reveals that installation is not yet complete. You may go 2 weeks with new patterns working beautifully, and then face a major life stressor that brings old patterns roaring back. This does not mean the work was wasted. It means the new patterns are not yet strong enough to operate under all conditions. Stress is actually useful information. It shows you where additional installation work is needed. When the stress passes, you return to the daily structure and give extra attention to the situations where regression occurred. What happens after 30 days depends on how complete the installation feels. Some patterns will be genuinely automatic by this point, running without effort, producing better outcomes than your old patterns, feeling like simply how you think rather than something you are trying to do. These patterns have been installed and will persist without continued daily structure, though occasional review helps maintain them over the long term. Other patterns may need additional time. Complex patterns that involve deeply ingrained interpretations or that activate in high-emotion situations often require longer than 30 days. The protocol is not a deadline after which everything must be complete. It is a structure for doing the work effectively. If the work is not complete at day 30, you continue, either maintaining the full daily structure or a lighter version that provides continued attention without the intensity of the initial installation period. Extending the protocol is not failure. Patterns that have been operating for decades do not always yield in a month. What matters is whether you are making progress, whether the new patterns are strengthening over time, whether the effort required to maintain them is decreasing. If those trends are positive, the installation is working. It may just need more time than anticipated. Installing new mental patterns is not separate from living your life. It is a way of engaging with the challenges your life already contains. You do not need to create artificial practice situations. Every decision you face is an opportunity to use the framework from the second chapter and build that pattern through real-world application. Every setback you encounter is an opportunity to use the protocol from the third chapter and strengthen that response through actual use. The experiences you would have anyway become the raw material for pattern change. This integration is what makes installation sustainable over the long term. Methods that require carving out separate time for separate practices rarely survive contact with real life. Methods that transform how you handle experiences you are already having integrate seamlessly. The 10-minute daily structure supports this integration without replacing it. What you are building through this process is not just a collection of better thinking patterns, but a fundamentally different relationship with your own mind. You are developing the capacity to observe your mental processes, to recognize patterns as patterns rather than as reality, and to deliberately install new responses where old ones no longer serve you. This capacity extends far beyond the specific patterns covered in this book. Once you know how to change how you think, you can apply that knowledge to any pattern, any response, any automatic tendency that is not producing the results you want. The mental gap between wanting and getting closes through this kind of work, not through inspiration that fades, not through knowledge that sits unused, not through temporary effort that collapses under pressure, but through deliberate installation of patterns that operate automatically, producing different actions and different results without requiring you to remember to be different. That installation is available to anyone willing to do the work. It does not require special talent or unusual discipline. It requires understanding how pattern change actually happens, creating conditions that support that change, and maintaining attention long enough for new patterns to become permanent. You now have everything you need to make that happen.